Good evening, everyone. I, on behalf of Beyond Law CLC and ULS Punjab University Chandigarh, welcome you all. And amongst us, we have Honorable Justice Maushami Bhattacharya, Judge, Calcutta High Court. And as we all know, the participants who have been following us on the Facebook page, Instagram, or otherwise as the participants on the Zoom application, that during this lockdown, we have been trying to bring various topics which invariably are those topics which are used by a professional, as well as it is for the knowledge of students, professors of the colleges and universities, especially in the field of law. And our endeavor in this is that we should always bring a person who is well versed with the facts and who can explain the insights of the subject. As we say, that the length and breadth of any topic can be made understood by a person who is well versed with the facts. Amongst us, we have Justice Maushami Bhattacharya, who is known for her style of explanation. Her knowledge and education is suffice to explain that. I will not go much into the nitty-gritties. Invariably, we are always having question and answer sessions after the keynote speaker gives us the insights. But today we thought that as we have amongst us Justice Maushami Bhattacharya, and we all know that there are challenges for the women within the profession, and today we will be having an interactive session to have the insights, what are the challenges within the profession when you are a lawyer or when you are a judge, how the society takes it, and what are the guiding key points that where a lady can make a point. Undoubtedly, the ladies and the women are making a mark within the society, especially within the profession. Large number of judgments are rendered with the able assistance of the lady lawyers, the interns, as well as the judges. Without taking much time, I will call upon Justice Maushami Bhattacharya to give the insights. Today amongst us, we have a topic that there's no stopping of injunctions. The topic itself seems to be quite interesting, and the facets about it we thought we should have from Justice Bhattacharya, who fortuitously is having the roster, and she will give insights of the said subject. Thank you, ma'am. On behalf of Beyond Law CLC and ULS, I welcome you.
Thank you, Mr. Chatrat. Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I know it's webinars are kind of one too many these days, and it's a one-way street, unfortunately, thanks to the medium. I just hope that I can keep it interesting so that your attention does not flag. It's very easy for attention to to be distracted just listening to somebody for more than half an hour. So without much ado, my topic today is injunctions, and the reason why I chose the particular sentence or the phrase that there's no stopping is because what injunctions were before when it started, and I shall dwell a bit on the history, on the historical aspect. Now injunctions have become a totally, I can just draw an analogy between two motor cars racing, and one is the court, who is looking all around for wrongdoings, for parties to come and plead their case, say how urgent the matter is, how imminent the danger and the risk to property is, and plead for an injunction. And whereas the other motor car, which is which was at least running parallelly all this while. But now one gets the feeling that, this other motor car, which is the avatar which injunctions have taken now, is kind of, changing the avatar every minute, racing towards the conclusion. Um, you just can't stop this second car, before a court even conceptualizes as to how an injunction can be made effective. You have five different choices before you as to which would be the best way of stopping the wrongdoing, as it were, and more importantly, to give complete relief to a party. And of course, the other three prerequisites of an injunction, which I shall come by and by. So, quickly, an introduction. Injunction, as the word indicates, shorn of any law or legal construction, is to stop, is to enjoin, is to require a person to refrain from doing a particular act or to do a particular act. Now, it is a discretionary remedy granted or refused in accordance with the principles elucidated by the courts, and which can be enforced through proceedings in contempt. Because there must be a mechanism where how orders should be enforced. The proceedings, basics first, the proceedings must ideally be served on the defendant. And apart from ex parte injunctions, which merit an order in the absence of a defendant, and the court must have territorial jurisdiction over the subject matter of the dispute. Now, the court can, injunctions can be of various types. There can be an injunction against a defendant for trespass to land, can be an infringement of a property right, which would include a patent, trademark, etc. Can be an injunction to prevent nuisance committed by a party. And the court basically is concerned with the protection of a right to property or a right which the claimant comes and demands. And the court should see that there should be an adequate remedy which would protect the plaintiff. Otherwise, in the absence of which the right which the plaintiff claims would have been diminished without or in the absence of an injunction, and the plaintiff would have no other recourse but to claim damages. Now, injunction is, of course, an equitable remedy. It is a remedy of an equitable nature, and it acts in personam. I shall come to certain deviations from this, particular injunctions in admiralty matters later on. Now, in cases of an interim order of injunction before trial, which is usually the norm, particularly in a commercial dispute, the court tries to arrive at an order with the least, how should I put this, with the least overall risk of injustice, aligned with the nature of the rights claimed, the stage of the proceedings in which the application is made, very important, and the purpose for which an injunction is sought, and of course the foreseeable effect of granting an injunction or refusing it. The little bit on the historical aspect, the law of injunction in India has its origins in the equity jurisprudence of England, which in turn was borrowed from Roman law. Now, when we talk of Roman law, the word used there was the interdict. An interdictum was a special edict, and edicta were orders essentially which were passed by a magistrate to the community at large. And interdicta were orders issued to parties in ascertained particular cases. Originating thus in the Roman interdicts, the law of injunctions was gradually absorbed in the English common law system, and in the equitable jurisdiction of the Court of Chancery, which lasted till about 18, early 19th, late 19th century. It should be 1873. Now, the natural corollary to my talk, or my what I'm talking about today, is what is equity. When we go on saying that injunction is a species of equitable orders of equitable nature, what is equity? Although there is, I was looking at Snell and a couple of other books for an exact definition of equity. Couldn't really find a definition, kind of fit-all definition. But suffice it to say that it can be defined as a portion of natural justice which is suitable to judicial enforcement, and which, for historical reasons, was not enforced by the common law courts of England, but was later enforced actually by the Chancery courts. And the aim of an equitable jurisdiction, or orders passed in equity, was to aim at a justice, a delivery system which was not repugnant to natural justice, equity, and good conscience. You know that the Government of India Act 1935, that nomenclature. Now, the word equity also means, in a wider sense, fairness. Fairness, and almost 300 years, 300 years after the birth of the common law system, to resolve disputes where damages was not a suitable remedy, equity was developed by the Court of Chancery in parallel with the common law to provide remedies for situations that were actually unavailable under the codified law, as well as to provide flexibility and a kind of a, how should I say it, a kind of a justice-oriented system. Now, since grant of an injunction is an equitable relief, it cannot be granted to those who do not, A, come to court with clean hands. Now, of course, we can't move around without clean hands, or is guilty of suppression of facts. And there are kind of unwritten rules when an order of injunction would normally be refused, when the court weighs the conduct of a defendant, or the conduct of a plaintiff, more important, together with how necessary it is to grant that order of injunction. We will, just a quick walk through on this part, and I will dwell on these aspects shortly. Now, the modern equitable remedies have been created by Philip York, who was the first Earl of Hardwicke and served as a chancellor from 1737 to 1756, and included essentially 4 remedies, which were specific performance, as in where damages were not adequate; rectification, which allowed a written document to be changed if it did not represent the actual agreement between the parties; rescission, number 3, which allowed parties to a contract to be put back into their original position, as if the contract was induced by misrepresentation; and lastly, the topic for today, injunctions, which was to stop a person from doing a particular act. Now, Black's Law Dictionary, we kind of go back to it all the time. I'll just quickly give you the definition of an injunction. An injunction is a prohibitive writ by a court of equity at the suit of a party complainant directed to a party defendant in the action, or to a party made a defendant for that purpose, forbidding the latter to do some act or to permit his servants or agents to do some act. For some of you, you may be familiar with, I at least know that at least some of the audience would be familiar with that when you're drafting a plaint, phrase in the plaint, you say, or by servants, agents, assigns, or by any other way, howsoever. That's of course the pleadings part of it, but an injunction should be effective and cover all, so that if it is a defendant, for it to be completely effective, it should also cover persons who are so closely connected with the defendant that in order to operate, if the injunction were to operate only against the defendant, then it would really, in matters of enforcement, there could be a problem later on. Now, what about the statute? I'm sure most of you are familiar with this aspect of it, but I'll quickly touch upon it. The law of injunction has been provided by under the Specific Relief Act of 1963, and of course the Code of Civil Procedure 1908. Section 36 of the Specific Relief Act heads with preventive relief, how granted, and it reads as: preventive relief is granted at the discretion of the court by injunction, temporary or perpetual. Now, the first discussion would be under temporary injunction, by far the most relevant and the most common of injunctions which litigants, counsel, and judges who are deciding matters will have to deal with, or have to deal with on a daily basis. And if I can take this opportunity to mention that injunctions really has to be seen from the perspective of these three sections. Not only how a judge would, somebody sitting on the bench would decide a matter whether or not to grant an injunction, but I think when you are drafting a plaint for a lawyer, for an attorney, for the litigant who's instructing the lawyer, injunctions have really three wholly different perspectives, and how and why an injunction is granted or refused. So the object of an interim injunction, or sometimes called a preliminary injunction, is to preserve the status quo pending the trial of matters in dispute, and it may be granted without notice as an ex parte injunctions, which is usually before the start of trial, and they are supposed to, at least under Order 39, expire, and also under the Specific Relief Act, expire upon the resolution of the proceeding, or at an earlier period of time as dictated by the, as specified in the order. Preliminary or temporary injunctions are not conclusive as to the rights of the parties, and they do not determine usually the merits of a case which are before which are in controversy. They for that interim period of time, they seek to prevent a threatened wrong, or cause further injury, or irreparable harm, or prejudice or injustice, until such time as the rights of the parties can be finally settled and adjudicated upon. In Halsbury's Laws of England, interim injunctions, actually I was looking at it today morning, quite interesting the way it's been placed in Halsbury's, finds place as part of interim remedies, the chapter on interim remedies, and is a part of a whole list of orders of detention, custody and preservation of property, orders of freezing or restraining a person from removing assets, the Mareva, shall talk about it shortly. Removing assets from the jurisdiction of a particular court, or even restraining a party from dealing with assets. It can be an order of injunction, directing a party to provide and disclose information which would be relevant for the adjudication of a case. And Halsbury clarifies that the fact that an interim remedy is not listed does not affect the power of the court to grant that remedy as an interim measure pending trial. Now, the next facet would be, what is, for issuing an order of injunction, what is the threshold test which is to be applied? Temporary and perpetual injunctions are defined under Section 37 of the Specific Relief Act. And the CPC also provides, I should mention, apart from Order 39, Rules 1 and 2, which everyone looks at, there is also Sections 94 and 95, which are actually quite similar. Section 94 of the CPC provides for supplemental proceedings and enables the court to prevent the ends of justice from being defeated. 94C states that a court can grant temporary injunction, and in the case of disobedience, can even commit the person guilty of non-compliance to civil prison. Section 95 provides that if a court finds that there are no sufficient grounds for granting injunction, or that the plaintiff does not have a good case, the court may award reasonable compensation to the defendant on his application claiming such compensation. There was a case, anyway, we should not relevant now. Now on order 39. Order 39, these are things which all of you must be knowing. Just a walkthrough, really. Order 39, Rule 1, enlists the situations when a court can grant temporary injunction, and these are any property in dispute in a suit which is in danger of being wasted, damaged, or alienated by any party to the suit, or wrongfully sold in execution of a decree, or where the defendant threatens or intends to remove or dispose of his property with a view to defrauding his creditors, or a situation where the defendant threatens to dispossess the plaintiff or otherwise cause injury to the plaintiff in relation to a property which is in dispute in the suit. And Order 39, Rule 2 provides that an interim injunction, why am I saying injunction? Injunction may be granted for restraining the defendant from committing a breach of contract or other injury, which of any kind, actually, to the plaintiff. I really cannot not mention Manohar Lal versus Seth Hiralal, AIR 1962, 527, which actually, where the Supreme Court held that the provisions of the Civil Procedure Code are not exhaustive, and a court can actually go ahead and grant temporary injunction if the interest of justice requires it to do so in the given set of facts. The Supreme Court was actually was also the view in that case that it may not be possible for the legislature to contemplate all situations which would necessitate a grant of a temporary order of injunction. So remember, when we were talking about equity, everything is, as I get ahead with my talk, you will find principles of equity, built and underlying all cases, statutes, provisions, forms of injunctions everywhere. In Gujarat bottling, the Supreme Court, that was 1995, 5 SCC 545. I will sometimes not give you the citations because probably also I don't have all the citations written down here. But in Gujarat bottling, the Supreme Court laid down certain factors which would call for a temporary injunction. And briefly, what are they? When the applicant has a prima facie case in its favor or his favor, the court will also examine the conduct of the applicant, and the conduct needs to be examined even at the stage where the application for setting aside of that order of injunction under Order 39 Rule 4 or vacating is considered. The third factor was, yes, the court has to examine the balance of convenience, that is the comparative, balancing the comparative loss caused to the applicant and the respondent when considering whether the case merits an order of injunction. This is, remember, we are talking of temporary injunctions, interim injunctions. And the court will also examine the extent of loss that would be caused to an applicant if the order is not passed, and whether monetary compensation would be would afford good relief or sufficient relief to the plaintiff. And Gujarat Bottling, of course, also said that the court has the power to direct a party to deposit security for compensation or to give an undertaking for the payment of the compensation. In which is the next, Wander and Antox, which was of 1990, that's 1990 supplementary SCC 727. The Supreme Court observed that interlocutory injunctions, it's important as to which stage the injunction is being considered and is being given, because the object of an injunction is to protect the plaintiff against injury or violation of his rights, for which he will not be adequately compensated in damages recoverable if the action were to be resolved in his favor in trial. A similar case was of I don't have it written down here, was of 1999. As far as I remember, it was volume 7, SCC, page 1, Colgate Palmolive, where this whole aspect of at what stage are you giving the injunction? Is it a running business? Is it the stage where the business is yet to start? And the court was of the view that if it is a running business, if the defendant has already built up his business and has, it may be months, it may be a number of years, the court should be comparatively more hesitant, more shy of granting that injunction, simply because equity demands that a person who has been in the business, expended valuable resources, effort in building up something, and the plaintiff, may have slept over his rights, taken his own sweet time and come to court. That kind of plaintiff should not be rewarded with a temporary injunction. In Lakshmibhai Patel, that was Lakshmikant versus Chetanbhai Patel. That was 2002, volume 3 SCC, page 65. That was, of course, a trademark matter, IPRs. The Supreme Court actually said that proof of actual damage is not essential, and that likelihood of damage, that's a very typically trademark formulation. Likelihood of damage is sufficient. And in another case, that was Deoraj versus State of Maharashtra, that was sometime in 2004. The Supreme Court also considered cases where grant of temporary or interim relief should be given, and that the appeal court should not necessarily or should not ordinarily interfere where discretion has been exercised by the first court. We find similar principles in Wander and Antox as well. Now, what is prima facie case? Remember, I said that there were three: prima facie case, balance of convenience, and irreparable injury. So we come to the first one. What is prima facie case? Prima facie case really does not mean that a case has to be proved completely or to the hilt, but a case which can be said to be established if the evidence laid in support of the same were to be believed. While determining whether a plaintiff has a prima facie case or has made out a prima facie case, the relevant consideration would be whether on the evidence on the first day, ideally, it is possible to arrive at the conclusion that the plaintiff has a case which merits the consideration for grant of an interim injunction. In American Cyanamid, it was, I'll come to it in a minute. In American Cyanamid versus Ethicon, instead of prima facie case, the issue was whether the plaintiff had a serious issue to be tried, or was it a serious question to be tried. Second one was irreparable injury. Is irreparable injury? Irreparable injury, as the nomenclature, the name suggests, is such an injury which can never be sufficiently compensated or remedied by damages. And if the court were to say that, very well, I will not give you an injunction, but I will see to it that you are monetarily compensated, the plaintiff will not be happy with this kind of a decision. And or simply put, if the plaintiff was to be given the money as compensation and he were to succeed even at trial, then the plaintiff would not be put in a position which he would have gained had he got that injunction in the first place from the court. The third factor is balance of convenience, and here we have to mention American Cyanamid versus Ethicon, that is of 1975, appeal cases 396. This basically really changed the rules of the game as far as temporary injunctions were concerned, and involved a case where the plaintiff, you may not be relevant, but I always find the facts of a case to be very interesting, and in a way, if you know the facts, it kind of helps you to remember the case also. The plaintiff owned a patent for surgical sutures. Sutures are, if you have a wound or some sort of a surgery, you kind of actually stitch it. Surgical sutures. And in that case, the defendant was about to launch the defendant's sutures in the British market and challenge the validity of the plaintiff's patent. The first court found that the plaintiff was likely to succeed at trial and granted an injunction in favor of the plaintiff. The Court of Appeal found that the plaintiff actually did not have a prima facie case of infringement. And ultimately, the issue before the House of Lords was whether there was a rule at all that interlocutory injunctions could only be granted where the court was satisfied on a balance of probabilities and on the evidence that the plaintiff's right would be infringed. the House of Lords held that once the plaintiff succeeds in the threshold of a serious, it was serious issue, not question, serious issue to be tried, then the court should consider three questions. What are the three questions? Very interesting, actually. I keep going back to these principles. Very quite fascinating. That if the claimant were correct at trial, an award of damages would be an adequate remedy, and whether the defendant is in a financial position to pay the damages. Very practical. Second, if the injunction was granted and the defendant was successful at trial, then would damages be adequate, and can they be recoverable under a cross undertaking? And hence, there would be no reason on this ground to refuse an injunction. And the third was balance of convenience, whether it only arises when there is a doubt as to the adequacy of the remedy of damages. What is the relevance of American cyanamide? I mean, why is it relevant now? It was 1975 case. To my understanding, interpretations may be different. Is American cyanamide actually focused on preserving the status quo, and whether, if in the event injunction was refused and the plaintiff's monopoly over that particular property came to an end, and so as also his ability to build a lasting goodwill for the period of monopoly, whether that would be an irreversible loss to the plaintiff. And hence, it was always important to weigh the relative strength of each party's case before a court grants or refuses an injunction. The risk of injustice to the defendant was also a relevant factor, which American cyanamide actually trained the spotlight on. And the risk of injustice to the plaintiff if an injunction was to be refused at the temporary stage, and whether also there were matters of public policy or public interest which would have an effect on the court's decision to grant or refuse an injunction. There was a case, Dalpat Kumar versus Prahlad Singh, 1993. The American cyanamide principles were actually used by referred to by the Supreme Court and approved, particularly the prima facie case, as opposed to a serious question to be tried, balance of convenience and irreparable harm. There's a recent case of the Supreme Court, Ambalal Sarabhai, that's 2020, versus Infraspace, which also took into account these principles. And the Supreme Court was the opinion that if the plaint if the dispute involved complicated questions of fact, that then maybe the court should also consider the issue of trial of those disputes. We next come, so that's temporary injunctions over. But I really can't proceed to the next part of my talk without pausing for a moment as to what are orders of status quo. When I was at the bar, and people in the profession, we have come across plaints and petitions where it was always status quo, order of status quo, prayer, it could be prayer C or D, and the courts we found would also grant injunctions, injunction of status quo. Now, I often wondered actually that, what is status quo? Status quo is actually, to put it simply, the state of affairs at the state of affairs prevalent at a particular point of time. So hence, I think it is of immense importance that not only while at the stage of drafting or pleading or arguing before a court, but also while passing an order, uh, the time, what time is meant when you say an order of status quo? What is the time which is meant? Because that has to be at the situation that was existing at a particular point of time. So that has to be made sufficiently specific and clear. So as also what is the subject matter of the dispute? Because one problem which may arise is because is if the order is just an order of status quo simpliciter, then at the time of compliance of the order, or if the party comes forward and files contempt proceedings, it may be actually very difficult for the court to ascertain and go back in time as to, oh, really, did I pass this order? What exactly did I mean by it? So it is of extreme and utmost importance that orders of status quo should really mention as to which point of time you are meaning. I mean, the oft quoted example of a house demolished half, demolished in full, and beginning of the demolition process, something like that. It should be very clearly mentioned. Without wasting too much time on temporary injunction, permanent or perpetual injunction, next thing, next topic. That is all naturally granted after the final determination of the rights of the parties, and should ideally prevent the necessity of the parties from bringing action after action for every infringement or infraction of the rights which have been determined by the court. The jurisdiction to grant an injunction is dependent upon the existence of a right, and which may or may not be contractual, and coupled with circumstances which make it equitable to make an order of perpetual injunction. In most cases, no action for injunction will start unless there has been an actionable interference with the plaintiff's rights, and it is not necessary for the plaintiff to wait until his rights have been interfered with, provided the court is satisfied, of course, that there is a real risk of future interference. Even if such future risk is shown, injunction in quite a number of cases, depending, of course, on the facts, may not follow as a matter of course, since the remedy is discretionary in nature. In order to obtain such an injunction, the plaintiff will have to show some property right or interest, at least in the subject matter of the property, and where special damage is an ingredient of the cause of action, as in the tort of slander of title, injunction will not be granted ordinarily, of course, in the absence of proof of special damage which has been suffered. Permanent injunctions may be issued at the end of the trial as part of the court's final judgment, and they usually enjoin a specific right or acts permanently for as long as the relevant circumstances exist. Under the Specific Relief Act, Section 37.2 lays down that a permanent injunction can only be granted by a decree at the time of hearing and upon the merits of the case, or in other words, for obtaining a permanent injunction, a regular suit is to be filed in which the right claimed is examined upon merits, and finally the injunction is granted by means of a judgment. Section 38 of the Act specifies certain circumstances under which permanent injunction may be granted. I really don't want to go through those circumstances. It's better not to say things which you can just open a book and find out. However, what is important is there has to be a case where the defendant invades or threatens to invade the plaintiff's right to the enjoyment of property. And in those cases, the court will grant a permanent injunction where there exists no standard for ascertaining the actual damage caused or likely to be caused by the invasion, and where the injunction is necessary to prevent multiplicity of judicial proceedings. All the pleadings which we normally give in a plaint. And Cotton Corporation of India, 1983 Supreme Court, 1272, had said that, held that an injunction to restrain the defendants, or rather injunctions of this nature, courts should see to it that if an injunction, temporary injunction, is not in aid of the final relief, then such an injunction cannot be granted. It should also always be in aid of the final relief. Last part of this section is an ex parte interim order. We all know of Shiv Kumar Chadha and Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley versus Kartik Das, 1994, 4 SCC 225. Just see how the equitable principles are shining through, through all of this. Morgan Stanley actually laid down, formulated as to when an ex parte injunction can be granted, and made it clear that such an injunction can be granted only in exceptional circumstances. What are these circumstances? Whether irreparable prejudice will be caused to the plaintiff, whether refusing an interim order will cause greater prejudice than would be caused if injunction were to be refused. Whether refusing an interim order will cause greater injustice that would be caused if injunction were to be granted. Yes. What is the time when the plaintiff first had notice of the act complained of? Whether the plaintiff had slept over his rights, whether the plaintiff has come with utmost good faith, and made it very important that the order, such an order, an ex parte interim order, should be only for a limited period of time, and the general principles of a prima facie case, irreparable injury, and balance of convenience should always be kept in mind. Morgan Stanley, of course, these principles have been followed in 2016 by the Supreme Court. The case is Tungabhadra Sugar Works versus Mazdoor Singh, 2011 and 2012, Sequeira Fernandez, etc. You can actually look at those cases later on. Mandatory injunctions under Section 39. That's the next of the Specific Relief Act, which is basically restraint of threatened action when the court may compel specific performance of an act and issue a mandatory injunction commanding the performance of a positive act, therefore mandate, compulsion. That's under Section 39 of the Specific Relief Act. And mandatory injunctions are generally of two types. One is restorative, where the injunction is of restoring the status quo by requiring the defendant to do an act and enforce mandatory injunction requires the performance of some positive ascertained act, and often on a continuous basis. an English case under this Red Redland Briggs versus Morris, which was of 1970, where Lord Upjohn said that a mandatory injunction can only be granted where the plaintiff shows a very strong probability upon the facts that grave damage will accrue to him in the future. It is jurisdiction to be exercised sparingly and with caution, but, but unhesitatingly in the proper case. So that's the first part of my talk done. The second part is types of injunctions, which is really, the more interesting part. The first part is, all of you know. Second part, I'm sure also. The first very popular type of injunction now is a freezing order, or what is called a Mareva injunction. A Mareva injunction is called a freezing order and can be said to be an extraordinary equitable remedy intended to prevent a genuine risk that a defendant would dissipate his assets prior to the conclusion of trial or prior to the adjudication of the party's rights. Typically granted on a motion brought by a plaintiff, and the function is to maintain the integrity. I read this somewhere. I like the language actually. To maintain the integrity of the court process by preventing the defendant from dissipating assets and becoming judgment proof. That's the word, judgment proof. Contrary to popular views, I think the concept of Mareva first emerged in a case called not the Mareva case, but Nippon Yusen Kaisha versus Kara Georgis. That's of 1975. It's a weekly law report, reported also. And followed by, of course, the famous Mareva Campania Naviera versus International Bulk Carriers, which is of 1975, to Lloyd's Report 509, also All England Law Reports. I must tell you the facts, interesting. Shipowner lent the Mareva, which was the name of the foreign of the vessel, of the ship, to a foreign charterer. The charterer defaulted on the payment. The ship owner found out that the charterer has money in the charterer's English bank account and sought an injunction for freezing that particular bank account. The order granted prevented the charterer from moving the money abroad before the case was heard. Extraordinary relief, but extremely effective, because I mean, what is the point of getting such an injunction or any kind of injunction if at the end of the day, at the end of the trial, the defendant turns around and says that, look, I don't have money to give you, if compensation were to even be an adequate remedy in the circumstances. Recently, in 2018, it was Vijay Mallya's case versus State Bank of India, SBI. Yes, that was when all that trouble was going on with the particular person not being able to pay his dues. When the court that was Karnataka said that actually agreed with a ruling in the English courts, where the English court had found that the particular party was trying to dissipate his assets and taking an inordinately long time to appeal and get the court processes moving. So the High Court felt that this was a fit case where a freezing order can actually be issued. In India, there have been quite a number of cases apart from this, the Karnataka High Court case. But generally, the factors or the principles which are followed is at any stage of the suit, where if the defendant is going to run away or dissipate his the whole of his property or is or a part of it, so as to render the claim ineffective or frustrate the claim, then the court should step in. And you know, so completely similar to Order 30 Rule 5 of the CPC, attachment for judgment, where you will find the same principles, in order to protect the plaintiff, even if the plaintiff, even if the final outcome was unknown, that the defendant's assets and properties must be preserved so as to do complete justice in the matter. There was another case which I should mention, that was Siskina versus Distos Campania Naviera. That's a 1979 appeal cases 210, where Mareva was considered by the House of Lords and involved cargo interests. Siskina was again the name of the vessel. Cargo interests having a claim against a company based in Panama. In that case, the dispute had no connection with England. The defendant's ship had sunk, and the defendant was entitled to insurance proceeds in England. The House of Lords held that there was no jurisdiction to commence substantive proceedings in England, and consequently there can be no Mareva injunction. But later on, we find some cases I came across that this formulation changed in England, and courts actually stepped in and said that we should give a Mareva and freeze the assets where the facts cry out for such an order. In coming back to India, in 2007, in right approach, the appellant prayed for an ex parte order of Mareva before the Supreme Court, and the court held that the assets should be freezed, or the assets of the debtor in that case should be freezed to prevent the assets from being dissipated. Another case is Tata Sons. Recent case, not so recent, 2008 of the Supreme Court would be Raman Tech versus Process Engineering, where the Supreme Court actually added a cautionary note and said that the plaintiff should not use the Mareva as a tool for converting an unsecured debt to a secured one, or to coerce the defendant into a settlement to give the plaintiff a priority over the defendant's assets. So that's Mareva done with. Next, search order or Anton Pillar. Each of these cases, whether it's Mareva or Anton Pillar, take their name from a particular case. In this case, it was Anton Pillar KG versus manufacturing process. That's of 1976, 1 Oliar 779. This was, of course, a case which dealt with trade secrets, or rather the theft of trade secrets. And the unique feature of the case was that the court allowed the claimant, accompanied by his lawyer, to enter the defendant's premises and force the defendant to allow the plaintiff and the lawyer to inspect documents, and not only to inspect but also to remove certain documents as was specified in that particular order, which was granted by the court. Why is this case important? The plaintiffs in this case had made electrical equipment and employed the defendants as their agent in the UK, and after a while suspected that the defendant was selling the plaintiff's technical drawings to third-party competitors, and therefore the plaintiffs came and applied for an order. the court held that the facts of the case necessitated that that an entry, a search order, should be passed in order to enable the plaintiff not only to enter the premises of the defendant, but also to seize certain documents, search, inspect, and remove the documents in order to prove that the defendant had indeed shared or um, gone against the secrecy which the agreement between the parties contemplated. Anton pillar is used generally in cases where there is a high probability that the defendant may destroy crucial evidence which is importantly in the custody of the defendant, and more so for the sole purpose of defeating the ends of justice. So that way, the courts step in to prevent, to protect the ends of justice. And of course, it's an exceptional remedy. The criteria generally is that there should be an extremely strong prima facie case. So just, like a kind of a wishy-washy case here, there may not be, will not do. Second, the potential or actual damage which will be caused to the plaintiff should be of a very high order. And thirdly, there needs to be clear evidence that the defendant has indeed incriminating documents in the defendant's possession, coupled with a real high possibility that the defendants will destroy those documents before the rights of the parties can be adjudicated upon. So, it's all a kind of a protecting and preserving the status quo and seeing to it that the best possible order can be passed, whether at the interim stage or at the final stage. There was a Supreme Court, 2004, difficult name to pronounce. What is this? Bicarus Europe Limited versus Vulcan Industries, where again certain other where the same principles were laid down by the Supreme Court for grant of Anton pillar, which I just now mentioned. So Mareva, Anton pillar, over and done with. Next, Quia-Time-Met injunction. Quia-Time-Met, dime a dozen nowadays, apprehension based on an apprehended infraction of a right, generally available where the injury to a claimant is feared or his right is threatened. So the injury has not actually happened, but the plaintiff comes to the court and says that, look, if you don't protect me, I will be dead, nothing will remain. What are the cases? What are the kinds of cases? A release of a movie, release of a film, release of a record, a book, performance of a play, mostly intellectual property matters. In these days, very tough questions for the court to consider and for the parties to argue also, because simply because of the vast and uncontrolled nature of technology, social media. If you were to stop a movie, what is the chance that the movie or snippets of the movie or even the whole movie actually has not already been pirated and released in some site somewhere in the world? So what is the sanctity of that? Quia-Time-Met, there was a case, Angela Drury versus Secretary of the State of Environment, which is of 2004. It's England and Wales Court of Appeal decision of 2004, followed by Redland Briggs, that's of 1970, older case, where again Lord Upjohn summarizes two types of quiet I met, where the defendant has not yet done harm, but is threatening and intending to act in a manner which will cause irreparable harm to the plaintiff or his property, and where the plaintiff has been recompensed already for the damage that he has suffered, but alleges that the earlier actions may lead to a future cause of action yet again for him to come to a court, approach a court, and ask for a quiet I met. Usually, as I said, infringement of copyright cases, films, records, books, goods involving brands, trademarks, brand names, where with one launch in the market or in the media, if the plaintiff waits, then by the time the plaintiff actually gathers his resources and comes to the court, it will be too late. His whole cause of action may become infructuous, and nothing may remain. I mean, the number of times a commercial involving an allegation of infringement of a brand, the number of times a commercial may be beamed on television, for example, even in a span of a day. But if the plaintiff wastes even one day, maybe, I mean, nothing will remain of his brand name. And remember, in IPR cases, a lot of action is built across goodwill and brand name and reputation. So all these factors should be weighed by the court. In Novartis versus Ranbaxy Laboratories, 2014 Supreme Court cases, a quiet I met injunction was passed restricting the defendant from launching a product. In that case, it was a pharmaceutical drug, and the court quoted Wander and Antox in that case and says that if the injunction is refused, that does not ipso facto entitle the defendant to market the goods, and even if it is found that the defendant does not have a proprietary right on the particular mark or brand name. Hosts of cases, Inox Leisure, PVR, etc. Nowadays, it's very easy to get the cases. So I don't want to burden you with so many cases or waste time on that. Just quickly run through of the kinds of injunctions. Next is anti-suit. Possibly one of the most interesting, one of the most debated, and the most topical species of injunctions one comes across these days. In the area of conflict of laws, anti-suit injunction is an order issued by a court which prevents an opposing party from commencing or continuing a proceeding in another jurisdiction or forum. An anti-suit injunction has a direct impact on foreign proceedings, resulting often in the termination of the foreign proceeding, and often overlaps with matters which, in the absence of the injunction, would fall to be determined by the foreign court. The most important case, the most famous case in this branch of injunctions is of course Modi Entertainment versus WSG Cricket. That's 2003 for SCC 341. Interesting facts. In that case, WSG, which was the respondent before the Supreme Court, had granted a license to Modi Entertainment to telecast a match in Kenya on Doordarshan and sell advertising slots. Disputes arose between the parties, between Modi and WSG, and WSG consequently threatened to discontinue permission to telecast the match. Modi Entertainment filed a suit in Bombay High Court claiming damages, while WSG filed proceedings in England. In that case, the contract had English courts as a non-exclusive jurisdiction, and Modi also filed an anti-suit injunction in Bombay High Court, saying that the English proceedings were vexatious and that India was the natural forum. Remember, as I said, England was the non-exclusive jurisdiction in the agreement. The Supreme Court refused the anti-suit injunction and held that even though England did not have any nexus with the subject matter, was not important. What was important is that the intention of the parties, as evidenced by the contract, had to be given effect to. Modi Entertainment remains the most important case as far as anti-suit injunctions go, because the Supreme Court formulated the factors for grant of anti-suit injunctions. What are these factors? That the defendant is amenable to the personal jurisdiction of the court. If injunction is declined, ends of justice will be defeated. 3, principle of comity of courts must be kept in mind. 4, court should take into account which is the forum, convenience or non-convenience, so that the proceedings are not oppressive to any of the parties. What is fifth? What is the clause in the contract? Does the clause contemplate an exclusive jurisdiction clause, or does it not? Next, a court will normally grant an injunction if the proceedings have been instituted in the unnatural jurisdiction, unless there are exceptional circumstances. Next, no injunction if parties have approached a neutral forum of their choice, or the parties are governed by the law applicable to the contract. Generally, the Supreme Court laid a lot of stress on the intention of the parties vis-a-vis the contract. And last but not the least, that the burden of proving that the forum of choice is a forum non-convenience or is an inconvenient forum would be on the party who seeks the anti-suit injunction. There are quite a few cases, Devi Resources versus Anglo Exports of Calcutta High Court. There's Board of Cricket, BCCI versus SL Sports, Delhi High Court, all on the same principles, courts following the same principles, and saying, of course, adding that courts will have to be very circumspect where the foreign party has already instituted foreign proceedings in a foreign court. And this whole notion of service on the party and which forum would be vexatious, which would be oppressive, those were all important considerations. In Horlicks versus Heinz, which is of 2009, it was held also that an anti-suit injunction, slight deviation, not from the principles, just an interesting perspective. An anti-suit injunction cannot be issued by a domestic forum against another domestic forum in India in view of the specific bar contained in section 41B of the Pacific Relief Act, which states that injunction cannot be granted to restrain any party from instituting or instituting or prosecuting in a court which is not subordinate to that court from which the injunction is sought. And of course, the principle that law confers on every person, you know, howsoever frivolous claim might be, to approach a court of law for relief, unless, of course, that is barred by some statute. And also laid down certain principles that the application is to be prompt, has to be made promptly, and the court should also bear the contemplation what the underlying dispute contemplates, and the proceedings must not be vexatious or oppressive. Recent case, HT Media versus BrainLink of 2020, where again Modi entertainment principles were relied upon, and the whole issue of forum non-convenience was gone into. What I must mention, you know, anti-suit injunctions have recently, well, not that recently, deviated into or gone into the area of matrimonial disputes. Very interesting. 2018, in Dinesh Singh Thakur versus Sonal Thakur, I'll give you the citation. It's 2018-17, volume 17, SCC 12. The case involved a husband filing a suit in the district court of Gurgaon for dissolution of marriage under the Hindu Marriage Act and for stay of proceedings, filed by the wife, who had also filed for dissolution of marriage in a court in Florida. In that case, both the husband and wife were citizens of USA. The Supreme Court refused to grant injunction on the finding that the US proceedings in Florida, which the wife had filed, were not vexatious, and that no grave prejudice or injustice would be caused to the plaintiff husband. There are, I found 2 or 3 other cases, not dilating on them right now, where anti-suit injunctions have been very effectively used for matrimonial disputes. A normal corollary to this would be whether anti-suit injunctions are the same as anti-arbitration injunctions, which is a species. Well, the answer is not necessarily. Anti-arbitration injunctions are really of a different order, very different. Why would I say that? 2 reasons. Because the Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996, which is of course a code unto itself, takes into account, you know, the entire gamut of situations which may arise when parties agree to go to a forum of choice, which is arbitration. So instead of looking at the CPC and Specific Relief Act, the court would look into the Arbitration Act 1996 to find out the correct answer, whether an anti-arbitration injunction, that is an injunction to stop an arbitration, should be granted or refused. I said 2 reasons. The second reason is of Section 16 in the 1996 Act, which draws upon the principle of competence, spelled with a K, or alternatively competence, which is essentially the arbitrators or the arbitral tribunal's power to rule on their own jurisdiction, which is now engrafted in Section 16 of the 1996 Act. Anti-arbitration injunctions, why I said they are quite, if not totally different from anti-suit injunctions, usually concerns a dispute of a variety of factors, including what is the law of the seat, in other words, what is the curial law, what is the law of the agreement to arbitrate, and thirdly, what is the law of the underlying contract. Um, Besides issues of conflict of laws, because the court looks at two different jurisdictions, usually India and some other foreign jurisdiction. There are a host of decisions from Enercon of the Supreme Court in 2014, McDonald's 2016, the High Courts, Calcutta High Court also has a host of decisions on anti-arbitration proceedings. But what are the general factors which one may mention? Usually, the dispute would involve whether an arbitration agreement exists between the parties or not. Very important. In a case, I think it was Albon versus NASA, 1998? Sorry, 2008, where the agreement, one of the parties went to the court and said that, look, there is no arbitration agreement because the entire agreement has been forged, or did the party say that the signature has been forged? Anyway, there was an issue of forgery in that case. The second point, the factor would be if the arbitration agreement is null and void, inoperative, incapable of being performed, which is essentially the language used in Section 45 of the 1996 Act. The third factor, whether continuation of the foreign proceedings would be oppressive, vexatious to the parties, or unconscionable to the party who comes to the court seeking an anti-arbitration injunction. And fourth principle would be, not a factor really, that given the scheme of the 1996 Act and the legislative thrust, now the trend is pro-arbitration. There is no doubt about that. Recent decisions of the Supreme Court, High Courts, everyone is, decisions are pro-arbitration. Why? Because it is the forum of choice. Parties have decided that, look, we will not go to court, we will go to arbitration for resolving our disputes. So Section 5 of the 1996 Act also engrafts it in the statute and limits judicial intervention, minimum judicial intervention in matters of arbitration. That always has to be kept in mind. So you will find very rarely that a court will actually come and say that you cannot go to arbitration unless exceptional circumstances are shown extremely vexatious, extremely oppressive to the party concerned. Next, quickly. Mr. Chatrat, I'll quickly wind up now. The next is Norwich Pharmacal Order. Norwich spelled Norwich. To explain what this is in simple terms, again takes its name from Norwich Pharmacal versus Customs, which is of 1973, to All England Law Reports 943, and which was a case concerning alleged violation of a patent by unknown importers. It is an order from a court to disclose documents or information that is available in that particular jurisdiction. Norwich Pharmacal Order is usually granted against a third party to force them to disclose relevant information and documents if they have been innocuously mixed up in the case at hand. And generally, individuals who hold that document or that material, they are put on notice, and they are put also on notice of the possibility that these documents and information may be required for doing complete justice to the courts. Norwich Pharmacal Orders also involve identity of persons, information as to the identity of persons in cases where the identity of the wrongdoers or defendants are are not ascertained or are vague or complete information is not there. And an application is made usually um, for for a certain class of persons um, to come forward and disclose information, and in turn, if they know of the identity of persons who may be involved in the wrongdoing. Since the jurisdiction of Norwich Pharmaceuticals are generally intrusive, um, because it involves the identity of persons, usually stringent requirements are required for the party who is seeking such an order. Next, John Doe, another very popular, um, very fashionable, I would say, to get a John Doe, to institute John Doe. John Doe, I thought for a long time came from the film Meet John Doe, starring Gary Cooper. John Doe being the common man, the common man on the street. But actually, it came from the concept came from. I was not correct, by the way. Did not come from the movie. The concept came from England, from Edward III, where uh, King Edward III, in his time, where orders were issued against unidentifiable defendants. Um, John Does are usually used where the defendants or the wrongdoers, as it were, are anonymous parties. You don't know their names, you don't know their identities, where they are operating from, which state, what is the scale of their business, how long they have been doing what they are doing. You don't know anything. So you come and institute a suit, you file a suit in the nature of a John Doe. In India, it's called Ashok Kumar, as in the common man. And I would say that, akin to the principles under Order 1 Rule 8 of the Civil Procedure Code, representative capacity, except that in this case, in a John Doe action, the defendants would be, as a kind of a unascertained group who would be sued together in a representative capacity. The principles were established in a 2016 case, Tata Sky versus, what is it? Noble TV. Yes, Noble TV 2016, where John Doe has been used as a tool. But the court has also said that filmmakers should think twice before using John Doe as a tool in their hands to prevent piracy, because it is a very powerful tool. Because remember, John Doe is not against one defendant or even 3-4 defendants. It's against a whole bunch of people, wherever they are. And usually John Doe orders are published so that the defendants get to know that such an order has been passed by a court. Otherwise, there's a real risk that the defendants, scattered through different jurisdictions, will not even get to know that such a preventive, that such an injunction has been passed against them. Usually, in matters of infringement of trademarks, brands, Taj Television, Rajan Mandal being a case in point, that's reported in 2003, Free Street Reports, where John Doe has been used, Ashok Kumar's. In Eros International versus BSNL, where extending the guidelines, John Doe has been used, not just for the executing authorities, but also for the plaintiffs to take all steps necessary against unidentified defendants. In that case, since it was the television concern, there was a host of ISPs, internet service providers, in various places. So that involved complicated compliance issues, complicated issues of stopping, and carrying out the order of the court. Other cases, Reliance Big Entertainment versus Multivision Network, 2011, Supreme Court. Then Reliance Big Entertainment Jyoti Cable, that involves the movie Singham, yes, Singham, where again John Doe action was instituted and came for scrutiny. The other one which I mentioned, Reliance Big versus Multivision, that involved the movie Don 2. So Don 2 and Singham, movies, where there's a risk of a large number of people, downloading clips, trailers, what have you, and using and beaming them everywhere. Next, that's John Doe. Very, very unused. I came across this for the first time, to be honest. That's a Bayer injunction, Bayer, Bayer injunction, again from the name, Bayer AG versus Winter, 1986. So that's not very recent, huh? 1 WLR 497. This kind of injunction, that's a Bayer injunction, forbids a defendant from leaving the jurisdiction, and often in a case where there is also an existing Mareva operating against the defendant, which is interesting. So it's a combination of a Bayer, a Mareva, sometimes even an Anton Piller. At least in Bayer, that was the case. Mareva, Anton Piller, and Bayer. And the English courts have actually, at various circumstances, clarified that the power to grant a Bayer injunction is actually an ancillary jurisdiction, and has used it in some cases against a debtor, to restrain a debtor from leaving the jurisdiction as an aid to the established procedure for enforcing the judgment. There's an unpronounceable case name. I'm not even going to hazard it. It's of 2015. Some Maj Dvorsky, Russian national, I'm sure, versus Bank of Pugachev, where a French national was subject to discovery and freezing orders in the UK, and also suffered an order preventing him from leaving the UK to attend a court appointment in France, because the court felt that the French national would use that as an opportunity to flee and not come back to the court and surrender to the court. Next kind of injunction, I'll go really fast. I've already completed 1 hour. Really fast. 1 hour? Yes.
1 hour 30 minutes, sir.
Sorry. Very, very fast now. Takedown orders. So what are takedown orders? Takedown orders, very popular in some courts now in India, where the intermediary, under Section 79 of the Information Technology Act, is usually at the receiving end of these orders and is asked to take down content, usually objectionable content, which is either something like child pornography or pornography in general, or in the nature of an infringing or infringes the copyright of somebody else. And the intermediary is asked to take down the content from the particular, it can be YouTube, it can be Amazon. The case I read actually involved Amazon and Flipkart. It can be Google, it can be Facebook. So the important cases are MySpace and Supercassettes of I think it was 2016, and Siddhivinayak and Amazon, which is of 2017, the Bombay High Court. Last part of my talk is the super injunction. As the name suggests, the most exciting of them all, super exciting. These are also called commonly gag orders, as in gag. You're familiar with gag orders, or at least what they would naturally entail. These are special form of injunctions where the court not only anonymizes the names of the parties, but also that such an injunction has been obtained in a court of law. So can you imagine the extent of that? So if I were to go to a court and obtain a super injunction, if you are the media or some newspaper, there would be a gag on you, not only to publish the fact, not only to publish my name, my identity, but also the fact that I have gone to court and obtained that injunction. So kind of a double protective layer. And usually I'm told, very very popular in the UK, and now apparently Northern Ireland has one of the highest number of super injunctions which have been granted. Interesting. Very very expensive also to obtain such an injunction. A lot of complaints against such injunction, a lot of ongoing debate, because they are supposed to be within the domain only of the wealthy, who can afford such court processes, and who are usually, there was an English footballer, there was an English TV presenter, who would actually go to a court and get such a super injunction to private, to protect their their dalliances, their secret affairs, their whatever. Because of course they were celebrities, they did not want newspapers to know of their private lives, or even to report that they have actually gone to court and got such an injunction. The irony of all this spending money for getting a super injunction is, of course, that injunctions, as you know, are territorial, territory involved. So even if you get, at least in one case, the English footballer, even if you get such a super injunction in England, there is no such stopping in the US. And in the US, not only his identity was disclosed, who he was seeing, that was also disclosed, soon beamed on the social media everywhere. So the entire purpose of going through the trouble of getting a super injunction, ultimately came to naught. So it's a very kind of a ongoing debate as to super injunctions. The last part is also, how injunctions have been used now in various ways, even now against workmen and trade unions. I came across one of three high courts saying that one, I think, was of Delhi Stock Exchange versus the Karmachari Union, where workmen were injuncted from demonstrating within a certain distance of the factory gate to prevent visitors, so that visitors would not be prevented from coming in, or there would not be large-scale disruption. Kerala High Court also passed a similar order in 1975, so earlier than Delhi, where workers could only demonstrate and picket 200 yards away from the factory premises, so that ingress and egress from the factory was protected. So that's pretty much it for today. A lot of other issues, as I keep saying, that injunctions are, it's like I just took a spoon of water from a river. So much more to be said. Compliance issues, vacating, so on and so forth. Extremely interesting, dynamic field, constantly growing, and thereby the name. There's no stopping injunctions. Constantly changing its shape, its form, its avatar, so that court, while having so very exciting, while having so many options to choose from, is also fettered by technology as to, even if I give the injunction, how do I enforce it? How many others do I have to, get involved, or how many others do I have to drag into the proceedings for the injunction to be effective? So, Mr. Chatrat, I'll really stop here, because I don't want to go on. There's so much to be said. Thank you very much. I've overshot my time by, I don't know how much. It's like, I'm really sorry about that.
It's around 7:10.
Yes, I'm very sorry about that.
No,
but
not at all.
Great. I had a lot of fun talking about injunctions. I just hope I've been able to catch your...
in fact...
Thank you very much for listening.
No. Ma'am, we never realized that how this Specific Relief Act, arbitration, CPC, IT Act, including, they could all be interwoven. And more fascinating fact during all this session was that, in fact, one of the participant has posted, because we said that we will not take the question answers. And in fact, we also never realized that we would be going beyond the schedule, because the
No, I
way
didn't
you
know
had,
about that because I really overshot. I should have actually kept.
no,
I should have asked you to give me an alert.
ma'am, the issue is that once you are being learning in the process, and that too during the lockdown, and once the topic is also there is no stopping. There was no
Yes.
question of having an injunction to the effect that we should stop the topic here and there and then itself.
I should have said that I should have been stopped midway.
No, not at all. In fact, the topic was one, but we have got the entire spectrum of various different acts, the way it can be utilized. We are in fact all indebted that the way you have taken us. In fact, when we had discussed the topic that kindly come on the board of Beyond Law CLC, I myself had not thought that we would get the insights of all different acts, Arbitration Act, IT Act, in one session itself. So it's more just like a rainbow, different colors coming upon, and we are just
Actually,
getting a.
I wish I could have dwelled on the IPR aspect of it because that's a whole new world, developing world. I should say IPR and injunctions. Very interesting, but actually there was absolutely no time for it.
Ma'am, point well taken. They say a good lawyer would be a person who can take the cue. We have taken the cue that we will call you for some session on intellectual properties, trademarks, because I can see on the Facebook and otherwise also the session has been well received. I will just take 2-3 questions, not on this thing. A lawyer has asked that he's trying to memorize all the issues, but he has been spellbound by the manner in which you could bring all the different acts, different judgments. What is the key to remember all such? He says, how do you funnel out these all acts, etc., in this thing and chisel it out, and then we can present it in the right sense? As a lawyer, as a student, what is the way to remember it? How is the way to go in a systematic and a synchronized manner? What is your take on that?
Well, I presume that you're asking me, or rather the lawyer's question relates to his particular, a lawyer's way of presenting a case?
No, issue is like we had, during this entire 1.5 hour, we could see that you could assimilate the facts in the right way. We could see that you have been able to remember the judgments of different acts in different way. What is the way a lawyer is wanting to ask? What is the way to remember all this?
Well, when you're presenting a case, that's a wholly different ball game, whole different ball game to when you're talking about something. So, and most of these cases, I've been kind of acquainted with for a while during, my research days and all that. So probably it's comparatively easier for me to remember the facts, even though actually I didn't remember the facts of quite a few of the cases. For a lawyer, it's all in the textbooks, it's all on the database. The only thing is that, when you're presenting a case, drafting a case, arguing a case, you just need to have the basic fundamentals at the back of your mind, which act you're proceeding under, and the principles. That should be enough. I mean, if you kind of too much knowledge, too much assimilation, I think that can only lead to confusion. So I think it's the best ways to keep it simple. That's the way I always used to do it.
No, but the way is, because you have been a successful lawyer and now on the other side, one wants to know that, let's assume as a lawyer, how should he go with the facts in a chronological manner and then actually put it across to the bench? Because time is also the essence there. It's just you have to present the facts.
The facts in a case, the most important point should be made first. I would think. What are you arguing? What is the point the case involves? What is the point? The legal point, and then of course, the facts should follow. The facts should be made simple. so that the bench understands, should not be made, not simultaneous relating of facts, but should be made in a very chronological way and in the simplest way possible, so that the court also remembers. Even if the particular court is not taking down notes, in as simple manner as possible, and then you mention the statute and show the provision, mention the case laws. That's it. As simple and as straightforward as possible.
But before we proceed to the question, I've just received a message from Justice Vineet Kothari. He just couldn't make an entry. We are just conveying it on the platform itself, that since large number of people try to participate at the last minute, that is, if it is the session is at 5:30, invariably large number of participants try to make an entry at 5:27, 5:28. What happens is that it's more like a gate crashing and large number of participants can't enter. So tomorrow, try to make the registration first, and Justice Vineet Kothari has conveyed. I'll just read it out. It says it was a very good, full of research session and case law. Please convey my congratulations to Sister Justice Maushmi Bhattacharya.
Thank you very much, Justice Kothari. Kind words. Thank you very much.
Because on one of the sessions he had also participated, that's why I had certain interaction. He knew that, so he was on the Facebook Live that the session it could be. He also had conveyed that he couldn't just make the entry. So taking cue from that point, that despite the fact that he wanted it, and we had no choices, we don't have a separate seat lanes that anybody could make an entry. I mean, one question which, being a successful lawyer and on this side, what is your take, how the ladies or the woman should maintain the balance between the family and the profession, and how to make a mark?
Well, I suppose this is my professional hazard in being asked this question. Fortunately, you mean to say in the profession how
yes, because sometimes they feel that.
Well, I would like to believe that the world is changing, perceptions are changing. I have been particularly fortunate now to have colleagues on the bench, friends who are absolutely, I don't think they have any such differentiating thoughts in their minds, and they only look upon me as a colleague. And fortunately, Article 217 of the Constitution is a gender neutral provision. Doesn't, just says, talks about the position, nothing else. So I think just hard work, perseverance, and that would hold for everybody. It's nothing to do with women or ladies in particular. Whatever challenges a woman faces is faced by everybody. So these are all, universal things. I really don't want to carve a separate niche for women or ladies in particular. I think everyone, men face equal number of challenges, hardships, and I really think the time has come when we should be seen as just one homogeneous set.
Undoubtedly, the point is well taken, but still, be that as it may, one always feels that how to maintain the balance, because we cannot shy away from the fact that people do expect from a lady to maintain the balance within the house, whereas
what do you mean by balance? What do you mean by balance?
Balance between the family and the professional time. Sometimes in the evening, one has to look after the family as well as in the profession, whereas sometimes the gents invariably sits in the office because they say that it's office time.
Mr. Chhatrat, I think you should also, have a slight shift in your gears when you ask this question, or whoever is asking this question, because I think that maintaining a balance is equally the responsibility and work of a man as well as a lady, and the number of sacrifices and adjustments and the shifting of gears pertains equally, in equal measure, to both. So a man equally has to look after the family. Women are increasingly going out to work. So really, I think, no differentiation should be made. Just hard work, perseverance and a basic level of intelligence, I think that should be enough.
And ma'am, Saloni Gautam asked, what are the most developing areas of career in the law as such nowadays?
Developing areas in the career of law.
Yes, let's assume as a lawyer, as a law officer or state counsel.
Yes, law firms are very popular, I believe, nowadays, because you get a lot of money at the end of each month, partnership options, etc. Unfortunately, very few are attracted to the profession. I wish that was not the case, but one can't escape the initial years of struggle when you come to the profession. So yes, law firms are very popular, but I wish that there is a change in the train of proceedings, and more people actually come to the profession. It will be good for everyone, for the bench, for the bar, everyone.
Ma'am, we are quite enamored that Justice Dama Seshadri Naidu was during that entire session, while you were taking us around the entire gamut of there's no stopping on the injunctions. We just thought that his insights, because he was also quite mesmerized the way you just summed up the entire things in the right gear and in the right form. We are just asking Justice Naidu to give his insights upon this.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Justice Naidu, for being through it all and for everything. Thank you very much.
Justice Naidu.
I've sat through the session. True, it's almost dinner time, but we have already had an intellectual feast. And for me, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
I can hear you.
And for me, it's a travel down my memory lane, where I could recall my initial learning. And also, I've learned a few nuances of what's been always a fascinating subject, injunctions. As we all know, this branch of law is the bread and butter of every civil advocate, and the session is quite engaging and interesting too. To Justice Maushami's credit, she has dealt with the subject exhaustively, and most importantly, she has ensured that our interest does not flag. Truly, the Honorable Judge did visit the English law, all species of injunctions, the Indian equity scenario, and the judicial interpretation both by the English courts and the Indian courts. In one word, I may say Justice Maushami has brought to bear during the session her mastery over the subject. I'm sure all the participants, and especially young advocates, have gained valuable insights into the subject. Dear Vikas, you may continue in your endeavor to present more such enlightening programs as we have today. I congratulate Justice Maushami on a stellar performance and thank you for providing me this opportunity. All the best for the future programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice Naidu. Without deserving much of what you said, I'm very happy that you sat through this inordinately long session, and thank you very much for your kind words.
This is mine.
Thank you, sir. Your words of encouragement that we should continue with our endeavor for the webinars. It goes without saying, once we have the speakers like Justice Maushami Bhattacharya, your good self, Justice Sikri, Justice Madan Lokur, Justice Deepak Gupta, all coming upon giving their insights. And as today we have seen, ma'am has taken us a session which was extensive, exhaustive, intensive, in all manners. We were just glued to our seats, hearing and hearing. It was as if the most fascinating fact, ma'am, I can share with you, that there was no injunction, but we still stood glued there and there itself. That was more important part. Otherwise, to have somebody state, you have the experience from both sides. Invariably, we have the more of captivated audience, but here it is a captivating moment for us. We have been captivated the way you have taken us on the different aspects. Thank you, ma'am. We have already this thing, but we would love that you should come on this platform once again. The insights from person having knowledge like you would always be cherished.
Sorry. I also actually missed out the Admiralty injunctions and the bank guarantees and all that, but there was just no time. So,
Ma'am, it's another way, what we say in the normal platform. The books invariably, whichever is a good authored by any author, invariably runs into 700 to 800 pages. But the way it is given in a capsule form, and we all know that capsules are the best way to treat in case of any this thing. So these are the capsules which actually stimulate the mind. Stimulate the mind in the right perspective. It gives us the mindsets, like that day Justice Naidu said, that art of advocacy and skills is more of stimulating of the mind. So once we have a stimulating session, there cannot be a better capsule. And the capsule which has no side effect, but only beneficial effects. Thank you, ma'am. Everyone stay safe, stay blessed. And tomorrow we again in the endeavor to bring good sessions. Tomorrow again on the civil part, we thought we should have the things in the right chisel way. Tomorrow we have Justice K.T. Sankaran, former judge of the Kerala High Court, who is well known in the academic fronts. He has been teaching on the judicial academies, and otherwise his also sessions on the YouTube are well latched upon the way today we latched upon the insights given by ma'am. Tomorrow we have one broad, very narrow scope of the civil procedure, but widely, which ma'am would also acknowledge, widely used in law, not only in the civil suits, even in the writ petitions, etc. Res judicata and res sub judice. So every member, according to us, should join that session. It's again at 5 o'clock. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, ma'am. We would love that you should join the session again. We are just enamored the way you uphold the things along in a seamless manner. Thank you, ma'am.
thank you very much, Mr. Chatrat, for a good introduction and rounding off. And thank you, everyone. Good night to all of you, and thank you for your patience.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.